delay, I'll move on to our first panel today. Uh, uh, in that panel, we have two papers. The first one is titled, within quotes, But Who May Abide? Reckoning with Ranajit-da. This is a paper by Saurabh Dube. And then we have another paper titled Science and the Subaltern by Projit Bihari Mukharji. I'll ask Dr. Zaad Mahmood to chair this session for us. Dr. Zaad Mahmood is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Presidency University, and his research interests include political economy, focusing on policy reform, capital-labor interaction, changing nature of work, and its politics and political participation. Thank you, Dr. Mahmood, for sparing your time for us. Please come and take over the proceedings. Thank you.
Welcome to day 2, panel 1 of this conference to celebrate the life and work of Professor Ranajit Guha. Dipesh Chakraborty, in a personal tribute to Guha, wrote, "If the individual and collective life of a scholarly community is shaped by experimental and radical turns it embraces and courageously recognizes, then come 2023, the past 100 years of Indian intellectual thought may well be marked as Ranajit Guha's century." To discuss the work and influence of Guha, we have amongst us two very prominent and accomplished scholars who continue the tradition. They engage with the subaltern question by interrogating the linkages between colonialism and modernity. So we are delighted to have amongst us Professor Saurabh Dube for a second time to presidency, I assume, because he was here back in 2014. And also Professor Projit Bihari Mukharji of University of Pennsylvania. So may I ask them to please come and join me on the stage? So quickly, because we are running out of time, basic introduction to our two accomplished speakers. Professor Saurabh Dube is a professor of history at the Center for Asian and African Studies, El Colegio de México, Mexico. He is S2, senior most category of research professor, and an elected national research level 3 scholar in the national system of researchers in Mexico. Professor Dube has an enviable body of work and academic accomplishment. He was elected a visiting fellow at Vienna. He was D.D. Kosambi Chair at the University of Goa. He was a fellow at Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Studies, and we can go on and on. Professor Dube's research explores questions of colonialism, modernity, law, caste, community, and religion. And apart from more than 130 journal articles and book chapters he has authored, some of them being The Untouchable Past, 1998, Stitches on Time, 2004, After Conversion, 2009, Subjects of Modernity, 2017. While I was scanning through Professor Dube's CV, I found that he also writes extensively in Spanish in a way that establishes a link between this part of the world and Latin America. He has authored Historical Anthropology in the Spanish language in 2001, and then he has a number of Spanish writings, which I'm not going to mention for the lack of my knowledge of Spanish, but genealogies. And then he has a 600-page anthology of his writings in Spanish for the last 20 years, which were published by the El Colegio de México. Among Professor Dube's more than 15 edited and co-edited volumes are Post-Colonial Passages, OUP 2004, Historical Anthropology, OUP 2007, Enchantments of Modernity, Rutledge 2009, Ancients to Modern, OUP, and so we are so delighted to have you, Professor Dube, amongst us. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We also have somebody we are very familiar with, Projit Bihari Mukharji. He was a senior here, and Professor Mukherjee is a professor in History of Science, Department of History and Sociology of Science, University of Pennsylvania, and a visiting professor to Ashoka University. And Projit-da's research focuses on the histories of science and medicine in modern South Asia. He is the author of Nationalizing the Body, the Medical Market, Print and Daktari Medicine, 2009, Doctoring Traditions, Ayurveda, Small Technologies and Braided Sciences, 2016, and most recently, Brown Skins, White Coats, Race Science in India, 1920 to 66. Amongst the monographs and edited books, some of them which are in progress, one which particularly caught my attention was Dunya.com, Computer Imaginaries in Modern Bangladesh, and Global Histories of Science, Medicine, and Technology. His articles have appeared in journals like JAS, CSSH, History of Science, Osiris. Two of his articles particularly piqued my interest because of their very provocative titles. And one was Subaltern Surgeries, Colonial Law and the Regulation of Traditional Medicine in British Raj and Beyond. And just after a few more citations, the other was Embracing Academic Elitism, South Asian History, Culture, which was a special section. So we are extremely delighted to see you, Projit-da, again amongst us. And with the housekeeping things, we are running a little short of time. So both the speakers will get around half an hour, and that should give us around 20 minutes of Q&A. Professor Dube, thank you.
Thank you for that generous introduction. It's a pleasure to return to Presidency. Each one of my 5 visits here has been memorable, and this occasion is especially so. I'd like to acknowledge the imaginative energies of the Bhabuk Collective, the warm alacrity of Upal, and the persuasive charms of Projit. And of course, it's a delight to be amidst all of you. Thanks, everyone, including the volunteers. In understanding the work of Ranajit Guha, I heed a warning that Arthur O. Lovejoy issued long decades, perhaps a century ago. Put simply, Guha's corpus should not be approached. Guha's corpus should not be approached as being all of a piece. I cannot countenance, for example, the emphasis yesterday of my Langotia Yar, Ajay Skaria. Instead, it is crucial to think through the inner pulls and formative tensions of Guha's thought and writing. The tensions traverse key shifts between opposed sensibilities and unfamiliar juxtapositions of contrary ideas. The pulls straddle subterranean continuities as bound to productive contradictions. To prudently track such fecund jumbles is to undertake interwoven readings. Thus, disciplines and their genealogies are now approached via the difference introduced in them by a particular scholar, Ranajit Guha, subject of a jaded colonial power, subject of in-your-face national regimes, subject of strangely shifting diasporas, subject of an increasingly melting planet. Yet, there's even more to the picture. For the critical hermeneutics being pointed towards themselves required being supplemented by and sieved through other properties. Properties of affect and embodiment, the sensuous and the immanent. These are all attributes that suffused Ranajit-da's work and life, verve and vocation. And they no less variously run through all our habitations. More about affect and immanence soon. The point is the following. To outline such an ambitious agenda is to itself forego any claims of realizing it in a short presentation. In their stead, I shall make short stabs toward quick evocations. The patchwork ahead is intended only to nudge at where my propositions can take us. I begin with the title of this talk. Its first part, "But Who May Abide," derives, of course, from Handel's magnum opus, Messiah. This is an aria, solo, that announces the coming of the Savior, but also the coming of an inaugural rupture. And so, but who may abide the day of his coming, but also, but who may abide the day of this coming? Of this coming. Such coming has been decreed already. Here, abide refers to the ability to endure this coming, a coming that is like a refiner's fire, whose blazing heat refines and redoes metals, a coming that is like a launderer's soap, whose bleach cleanses and purifies clothes. Needless to say, the metals and clothes point to subjects of endurance, the abiding, enduring subject of the Savior and of the inaugural rupture. All of this begets also the second part of the title, the distinct registers of reckoning and reckoning with, from the time of judgment and accounting of our actions through to tasks of understanding. This said, my purpose in invoking "But Who May Abide" is sixfold. Six reasons that are nested in each other. First, the coming, his and this, references millennial visions. Second, such millennial expectations suffuse not only the advent of the Savior, but the event of the revolution, each insinuating the rupture of the inaugural. Third, this millennial imaginary of the impending revolution and its tragic defeat have variously haunted Marxist thought and practice, including that of Ranajit Guha. Fourth, to invoke an aria of such force is to attend to the place of music and the presence of aesthetics, especially the literary, in Ranajit-da's life worlds. It's to invoke an aria of such forces to attend to the place of music and presence of aesthetics, especially the literary, in Ranajit-da's life worlds. Fifth, whether it is the aesthetics of revolution making, or the power of musical notation, or the demands of literary figuration, they intimate wider, affective, sensuous, embodied, and immanent properties. These properties have shored and structured, but also split and sutured Guha's word and world, the ways of his abiding, the manners of his enduring, the forms of his reckoning. Sixth and finally, as indicated earlier, none of this can be apprehended as being all of a piece. Rather, it turns upon the interweaving of distinct textures, including of fabrics of memory. I first met Ranajit Guha as an adolescent, actually on the cusp of adolescence. My brother Mukul, older than me by 11 years, was working for his DPhil at the University of Sussex. I was visiting him and traveling a bit during the summer of 1977 after my class 10 secondary school examination. Mukul was close to Ranajit and Meshtil Guha. Not a Shagird in Shahid's sense, he shared with RG a passion for classical music and Maoist politics, an abiding passion for, and a commitment to classical music and toward Maoist politics. In my single suitcase, I had carried 2 thick and heavy hardcover volumes, Panini's Grammar in the Sanskrit language. If this was my tiny indirect contribution to Guha's rendering of the Atidesha function in his elementary aspects of peasant insurgency in colonial India, it was repaid handsomely by Ranajit Guha's kindness. At a dinner at Meshtil's and Ranajit's house, a more than jollified Mukul began to mercilessly pillory my taste in rock music. He kept comparing Allah Rakha's tabla that was spinning on the turntable to Jethro Tull's drums that were my own abiding then. Struggling with near adolescent anger and answers, I was rapidly retreating into childhood. As my eyes welled up, Threatening to break into a storm of tears, RG asked Mukul to calm down, to take it easy. Basically, he asked Mukul to shut up. Although RG was my parents' age, from that moment, I began to think of him as Ranajit-da, following my big brother's nomenclature for his formidable mentor. In subsequent years, Ranajit-da would remember first meeting me when I was in shorts, embarrassingly true, and as variously being 12 and 8 and 6 years of age, a meaningful exaggeration. But before we met next, around the end of my BA, an engagement with two texts left the deepest impress upon my orientations toward history and theory. These books were Guha's Elementary Aspects and Pierre Bourdieu's Outline of a Theory of Practice. A little later, as a master's student, I wrote a critical appreciation. A little later, as a master's student, I wrote a critical appreciation of elementary aspects that was published in the EPW. It was titled Peasant Insurgency and Peasant Consciousness, and for a couple of months, I strutted around like a cool dude, the real deal. What was Ranajit-da's response? Mukul's little brother could not have written it, he announced, adding that under issue was mischief at the behest of Amir Bakchi and Shamit Sarkar. The terms of affection and exaggeration had carried over in RG's characteristic conspiratorial style. Just a little later, as a first-year PhD student at Cambridge, traveling for archival research in the US, Missionary Archives, I was invited for a talk. The talk was at the Anthropology Department of the University of California, Santa Cruz. The audience was small but distinguished, including, among others, David Schneider and Ranajit Guha. I strongly suspect that it was upon Ranajit-da's nudge that I was invited to the Third Subaltern Studies Conference in Calcutta a few months later in 1989. The textures of generosity and warmth never left. They were abundant in our meeting with Meshtil, our meaning Ishita's and my meeting with Meshtil and Ranajit-da this July. Can you hear me? Must be Amir Bakchi's mischief. They were abundant in the textures of generosity and warmth were abundant in our meeting, Ishita's and my meeting with Meshtil and Ranajit-da this July 2022, which Ishita spoke about yesterday, and I shall briefly return to in a bit. The point is that such encounters and entanglements are not just entertaining byways that passively accompany the serious pathways of scholarly substance. Rather, they are at the core of affect and immanence alluded to earlier that I turn to now. Okay, so my suggestions derive freely from a very recent book, Disciplines of Modernity. They're somewhat dense in nature. Apologies in advance. It's only 2-3 minutes. And I'm carrying the 2-month-old baby, Disciplines of Modernity, if anyone wishes to cuddle it later. Over to the density. In approaching and exploring academic and everyday arenas, it is critical to stay with corporeal, affective, sensuous ways of experiencing, knowing, being. These put a question mark on the pervasive presumptions of fully fabricated subjects, ever possessed of an already intimated reason. Such querying does not portray subjects as being pre-social in any sense, located as we are in necessarily heterogeneous yet ever overlapping life worlds. Asked differently, can apprehensions of social worlds eschew starting off with the bounded intentional subject, even as it foregrounds embodiment and sensuous life? Here, might affective circumstances take experiential precedence, experiential, not chronological precedence, might affective circumstances take experiential precedence over while being constitutively coeval with more formal procedures of reason. Indeed, with subject and sense shaped by elements of experience, might we also take a cue from Gadamer, who articulates, of course, a distinct intellectual tradition? Can we take a cue from Gadamer in order to ask, how do we open ourselves to the awareness of being exposed to the labors of history? Labors of history that precede the objectifications of documentary historiography and explanatory anthropology. So you can see my mischief in how I approach the disciplines of history and anthropology. It should be clear that I'm not speaking of the affective and the extra-analytical, each ever embodied in spirit and substance. I'm not speaking of the affected as a return of the repressed under modernity. Rather, I'm referring to the affective, the extra-analytical, and the embodied as routinely woven into our everyday and academic modern worlds. These each ever announce, well, immanence. I mean by immanence, and I speak of early immanence, I mean by immanence a recognition. I mean by immanence a recognition of value properties that actually inhabit the world, and not just as detached projections of words and images. Here, categories, academic and everyday, are far from being seen as principally instrumental explanatory devices. Instead, they are approached as constitutive attributes. Categories, academic and everyday, are approached as constitutive attributes of social worlds, which can also variously bear value properties. These value properties of objects and subjects. These value properties of objects and subjects, categories and imaginaries, make claims upon us, inviting and inciting meaningful practices. How might such immanent attributes of social life, including longing and loss, color and smell, good and bad, the sensitive and the sensuous, I mean the smell and the color, good and bad, the sensitive and the sensuous, how might such immanent attributes of social life be drawn into descriptions, woven into narratives? For is it not in these ways that we eschew that business as usual of a senseless science, as Johannes Fabian calls it? It is upon such grounds that I approach Ranajit Guha's Words and Worlds, at first drawing upon critically hermeneutics sensibilities, and then letting the affectively immanent break upon them. To start off, consider this. In his discussion of subaltern studies, Dipesh Chakrabarty spells out, quote, the tension between a familiar narrative of capital and a more radical understanding of it, unquote, within elementary aspects. At the same time, the burden of Dipesh's argument rests upon discussing the latter move, pointing toward, quote, the specific differences in the histories of power in colonial India and in Europe, unquote. In contrast, learning from Dipesh, but in contrast, I have for long been more concerned about thinking through such tensions by staying with them, patiently and modestly. Specifically, I have explored how the conditions of possibility of Guha's writing lie in its precise braiding of distinct orientation concerning the terms of history. These discrete orientations straddle the critical force of Guha's analyses and traverse the inherited attributes of his understanding. It is important not to mark off the one from the other in Ranajit Guha's extraordinary scholarship. To be found are critical potentialities and unrealized possibilities. Let us register that Ranajit Guha and subaltern studies at large presented the 19th century subaltern insurgent as constitutively coeval with British colonialism on the subcontinent. And the most dramatic manifestation of this was Guha's critique of Hobsbawm's pre-political, Hobsbawm's and wider critique of, notion of the pre-political. Although undercut by uncertain, although undercut by uncertain temporal spatial demarcations of the South Asian peasant, the analytical measure principally intimated exploring the subaltern on the subcontinent as a subject of modernity, subject to and subject of. Consequently, the move held the promise of understanding modernity itself in newer ways. Yet this did not come to pass, which should be barely surprising. For only a few years later, Guha made a case for dominance without hegemony in colonial India. He posited an archetype of bourgeois hegemony where persuasion outweighs coercion in the composition of its dominance. On offer was the classic prototype of the hegemonic liberal state representing a revolutionary bourgeoisie and democratic politics in metropolitan Britain. And against this stood the hapless instance of dominance without hegemony in colonial India. Shaped by immaculate assumptions of a vigorous democratic culture and a vital liberal politics of the modern West, Guha's analytics rendered the central historical lack of the subcontinent under colonial rule as one of failure and lack, except for the peasant insurgent. This lack was assiduously articulated by the bad faith of an autocratic imperial power and the ingrained limits of an ineffectual indigenous bourgeoisie. Evacuated of their, Evacuated of their own particularity, the meaning of Indian histories inhered in their lagging behind the time and space of Europe. In these teleological projections of colonial pasts and metropolitan histories, the incomplete transitions of the former, colonial past, appeared routinely measured against the fulsome trajectories of the latter, metropolitan histories, so that each showed up the other. At stake are articulations of an exclusive hierarchical temporality that spatially segregates Britain and India, the empire in its outpost, the West and the rest. Taken together, here is my point. It is central to attend to the simultaneous discourse in different, taken together, here's my point. It is central to attend to the simultaneous discourses in different tongues in Guha's writings. The move enables the querying of notions of an implicable breach, namely an innate contradiction between a modern democratic regime at home, Britain, and its endless retrograde omissions in the colony, India. It is in this way, too, that we question other common assertions regarding, which abound, common assertions regarding the entirely exceptional nature of, quote, colonial governmentality, unquote, and colonial modernity, quote, unquote, colonial modernity. In fact, I don't even need to use quote, unquote. They're so pervasive. And we do all this in order to track instead the mutual constitution. And we do all this in order to track instead the mutual constitution and reciprocal labor of modernity and colonialism in the metropolis and the margins, by interweaving anthropology, history, and social theory in my own case. Such analytical hermeneutics and historical anthropologies are very well, I hear you, the audience, sigh. But what of the effectively immanent, you, my interlocutors, ask? I can only telegraphically signal a few signposts. Effectively and aesthetically, ethically and politically, it is the millennial imaginaries of an abiding revolution that laid claims on Guha's vocation and verve, uneasily shoring up and breaking upon his life worlds. Unsurprisingly, such value properties variously split and suitured Guha's writing, from the structuralist sensibilities of elementary aspects to the post-foundational inflections of dominance without hegemony to the romanticist retreat of history at the limits of world history. As is known in elementary aspects, Guha reads and renders the common forms and general ideas of the consciousness that constituted insurgency in the manner of a code within a linguistic system. It is not only that this shared code underlay diverse expressions, various utterances of subaltern rebellion. It is also salient that insurgent consciousness, the common code of the historical register of subaltern rebellion, was preeminently political in nature. Each separately and taken together, here are to be found analytical unfurling and critical unraveling as bound to aesthetic imperatives and affective desires. These qualities privilege the politics of peasant insurgency, which is understood as the essence of subaltern consciousness and initiatives, the emancipatory and autonomous project of prescriptive reversal seeking to erase all signs of subalternity. Such yoking of structuralist technique and revolutionary millennialism was expressed even as neoliberalism staked its first claims on the global and the planetary. It was enacted upon distinct overlaying registers. It bears not only analytical and hermeneutic rendering, but affective and aesthetic reckoning, all signaling worldly imminence. For Guha, the other side of insurgency was domination. And it is to the latter that he turned attention in Dominance Without Hegemony, even as neoliberal capital restlessly bared its fangs in the 1980s. Now the revolution was not merely in retreat. Now the revolution was not merely in retreat, but slowly in defeat, unknowingly awaiting the meltdown of the wall, the collapse of the Soviet system. And so too, the affective and the aesthetic, the ethical and the political received a distinct twist. Now Guha endorsed newer post-foundational presumption, construing power and domination as totalized formations, dystopian nightmares, already intimated by Chandra's death. Yet he interwove these with an earlier millennial teleology. Of revolution and rupture. This telos was unsteadily orchestrated by inherited imaginaries of an immaculate West, remappings of Marxist thought, and a receded revolutionary subject. Now, the slow dance of post-foundational premise and millennial telos was far from being mere analytics at large, constructed solely out of abstractions as usual. Here were to be found instead living specters of immanence, whose value properties shook and shaped Guha's figurations. Across the long 1990s and after, Guha wrestled with the ghosts of a communist provenance. Across the long 1990s and after, Guha wrestled with the ghosts of a communist provenance, especially his own place, even complicity in the darkness, as Parthada reminded us yesterday. Should it be surprising then that Guha found himself compellingly drawn to the embrace of the aesthetic, the lap of literature, including via the small voice of history and at the very limits of world history? Were at stake perhaps anything less than the soul and substance of Ranajit Guha? At the end, I offer two images, each containing words that abide, the terms of a haunting. A little less than 100 years ago, Walter Benjamin had reflected on the articulation of history and a seizing of memory, conjuring the angel of progress, itself birthed by Paul Klee. Benjamin had prophesied, quote, "Even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins." And that enemy has not ceased to be victorious. Even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins, and that enemy has not ceased to be victorious, unquote. Today, the prescience of Benjamin's prophecy comes alive. Today, the prescience of Benjamin's prophecy comes alive as we are reminded that Today, the prescience of Benjamin's prophecy comes alive as we are reminded that the enemy has many incarnations. And so, with a terrible twist, the satanic now standing in for the redemptive, might we ask, but who may abide? Toward the close of July this year, we spent 3 marvelous hours with Meshtil and Ranajit Guha at their home abutting the Vienna woods. It was the stuff of life, some of the best our wretched worlds can offer. Lingering at the dining table over the local light as air Cardinal Torte and a Romanian red, Ishita asked Ranajit Babu if he had any regrets about his life. Ishita is brave man, venturing where angels fear to tread. In response, Ranajit-da shook his head and said simply, "No, what is done is done." But then he added that shrouded in the darkness of the night, poised between sleep and wakefulness, he often returned to the first and the early words of his mother and of the ones he spoke to her. A little later, after we had moved to his study, poised between books, his own and of others, clutching the past and the present in a single embrace, Ranajit-da whispered, "Words are all that I am, but who may abide?" There are different ways to abide, distinct manners to endure, yet there's no escaping their imminent claims and compelling value properties, for good or bad. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dube, for that wonderful exposition. You started off with affective and imminent, and the affective was so very evident in the way you spoke about Ranajit Guha and your memories. Now we have Professor Projit Bihari Mukharji, and so I ask Projit to take on the podium. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. Let me start by thanking Upal and Shukanna for this wonderful invitation to Shohini and Saurabh and the Bhabuk Sabha, as well as, of course, Zaad, with whom I had the good fortune of overlapping in canteen honors 2 decades back, as well as at the Institute of Education Pub at SOAS. So lots of memories. However, I must also begin by confessing that I have neither Saurabh's lyricism nor his intimate acquaintance with Ranajit Babu to offer. I have actually never met the man. So I have no anecdotes about music and wine and books or any of that. But I have had the good fortune of being taught by some of the people who were involved with the Subaltern collective from the very beginning. I've also had the very good fortune of being friends with some of them. And so what I have to offer is I believe I've been, I don't know, after Professor Spivak's talk, I'm not sure if it's affinity or influence, but something in some way, there's some connection between Ranajit Guha's project and my own work and what I've tried to do. And that's what I'll probably dwell on. So will it be like this or বড় হবে? না দরকার নেই, এরকম ছোট হলেও চলবে, খুব একটা ব্রেক করে। আচ্ছা, ও আচ্ছা, ওকে ওকে। Yeah, I've already confessed that I lack the lyricism, so I'll be a pedant and just have a PowerPoint up there. বা পরের স্লাইডটা গেলেও চলবে। So I thought, because I didn't know what else to say, so I thought I'd look into Ranajit Babu's own writings to see how we might approach an act of retrospection. And he actually helpfully has a few comments on this. In an introduction that he wrote to Barney Cohn's essays, he says of retrospection that it is true of academic work as of visual arts that there is more to a retrospective presentation than the mere sum of its exhibits. The order imposed on the latter by aggregation and seriality reveals in both instances an identity which is incomprehensible in terms of its aliquot parts. So he goes on with that. But so that gave me something to go on, that, okay, what I can do is I can come up with a new ordering of things, and hopefully that will add something to what we already know. So let me start by sharing 3 stories and introducing you to 3 young boys whose names I actually do not know, for they haven't survived in the archive. If you could go to the next slide, please. So, yes. So the first photograph was taken sometime in the March of 1938 at a place called Guma Pahad outside of Durgapur. There was an anthropologist slash geneticist, a very eminent scientist who taught at the Calcutta University, Shashank Shekhar Sarkar. Professor Sarkar took this picture, and what we see here, the quality of the picture is very poor, and I have not got a better one. What we see here is a burial ground or cemetery of the Maler tribal group. The Maler live in this part of around Durgapur, and Shashank Sarkar had accompanied that young boy, a teenager from the tribe, up the hill to look at the cemetery. The boy very obligingly took him along, showed him the place. Once there, Sarkar was surprised to see that the graves were very shallow because it was hard ground and there hadn't been rains. It's a dry part of the state. So the graves were very shallow and he could see a complete skeleton. So he got very excited that he wanted to take the skeleton out, bring it back to his lab in Calcutta and analyze it. The moment the young boy understood what was going on, he started protesting vigorously that you can't just take the skeletons. There were all kinds of cosmological and social taboos. But Sarkar was having none of it because the progress of science was at stake. The boy then, when he saw that what he had done, he opened the dreaded genie, let the genie out of the bottle. He went running back and he called his village mates. Men and women gathered there, including a woman whose mother this skeleton actually had been till a few months back, and protested that you cannot take this. But Sarkar was not deterred. He invoked he got the forest officials, who, of course, in this area have police powers as well, as we know from Prasumadi's work and others, that the forest officials came, the police came, and basically the men and women were ultimately made to, they did not agree, but they had no power to resist. And Sarkar put all the bones in a big basket and had the chowkidar carry it back to that ultimate monument of state power, the Dak Bungalow, where he was putting up. So that is my first young boy. The second boy is this other boy that you see in the middle, whose name too I do not know. But this is also a picture taken by Sarkar in 1952, when Sarkar was there working for the then newly constituted Anthropological Survey of India, which I always love to clarify is actually a nationalist organization founded in 1946 November. And Sarkar at one time was designated to be the second director after Biroja Guha, but that didn't work out. That's a different story. This picture was taken in Karnikobar in the Andamans. And this boy was basically a prisoner of a mission in Karnikobar. He was never captured. His mother, along with some of his siblings and an unrelated teenage girl, had been captured by the British Indian Police Force in 1938 again, in the September of 1938 on Bluff Island. And they were members of the Jarawa tribe, which has always been designated as a difficult, untamed tribe, savage, etc. Once there was a man in the group, he managed to escape, but a heavily pregnant woman with her children and a teenage girl were captured. They were brought back, put in this mission, and essentially kept in confinement from then on. Of course, as you know, Andaman was won by the Japanese briefly during the Second World War, then won back by the British, then the post-colonial Indian state inherited it. In the meanwhile, 2 of this group had died, but the rest was still living in captivity. They had been studied by Dr. Bijeta Chaudhuri, a very eminent doctor who was also a nephew-in-law of Tagore. He had published the first biological study of the Jarwa based on this group. But Sarkar realized that because this child was the child that his mother had been pregnant with, so he hadn't been studied. because he was not born yet when Bijeta Chowdhury's study appeared. So he went to Car Nicobar and studied him. The final one, I don't have a photograph, but it happened, this is just a graph, but it happened down the road at the School of Tropical Medicine in 1956-57, when Jyoti Bhushan Chatterjee, a very eminent hematologist and geneticist again, who also incidentally started dabbling in anthropology and became president of the Indian Anthropological Association. Jyoti Bhushan Chatterjee was interested in aberrant hemoglobins, so people who had thalassemia, hemophilia, and a number of other related congenital afflictions. So a young boy, actually two brothers, one aged 5, the other aged 7, traveled from Bardhaman they were not quote-unquote tribals. They traveled from Bardhaman because these kids were very ill. Jyoti Bhushan realized the medical college referred them to tropical. Once at the School of Tropical Medicine, Jyoti Bhushan realized that these boys were suffering from extreme and very painful anemia because they had aberrant hemoglobins. And at that time, there was an idea in the world of science. People were trying to work out whether these aberrant hemoglobins also offer some resistance from malaria. So what he decided is that the kids are anyways going to die. These kids don't live very long anyways, but we can try out whether they really are immune to malaria or not, and injected them with malaria falciparum, which is usually known as cerebral malaria, which people die from, of course. And this is a chart that he then published looking at showing the various physiological reactions to malaria in the bodies of these children. So the reason I assemble these three together is to give you a very, hopefully this serialization and this aggregation brings out something about science that we don't usually talk about. The incredible violence that it wreaks, that it continues to wreak, because it's a matter of absolutely insurmountable a catch-22, that even though science produces universal generalized knowledge, it does so on the basis of specific bodies, specific objects, specific things. And those specificities have to be, in the scientific publications, they're erased. Whose body did you do the trials on? Whose body did you study? Where did you get this plant from? What specific plant was it? Not the species. So we talk a lot about species life these days, but I want to go back to those individual lives and the pain that they have to suffer in the name of progress, science, rationality, nation, etc., to enable this progress. And this is something that I think is, you can hopefully see some resonances with a kind of subalternist project of where this comes in, but I'll go further with that in a minute. So let me now, having given you this kind of retrospective or my twist on what a certain image of science, I want to now also go to the story of how I arrived at these stories. All these three stories are in my book that Zaad very kindly mentioned, Brown Skins, White Coats. But how do I get to this? So if I can go to the next slide. So obviously, Ranajit Guha has very little to say about science. I don't think he says much of it. The only footnote to anything on history of science I've found is in Rule of Property, where there's actually a factual footnote to a work on history of science. But otherwise, he doesn't engage with it. However, many of those who were close to him have all written on the history of science. So I think the first amongst the original group was in 1986. There was an essay in Past and Present, Cholera and Colonialism by David Arnold, which then went into his 1993 book, Colonizing the Body, and he's my PhD supervisor, so that's my route through him. There was an essay in 1988 in Onushtup. That's not the 1988 Onushtup. I was trying to look for the picture, but only Ratul's picture kept coming up on Google Books, on Google Images. So, but in 1988, Dipesh Chakraborty had an essay called, I think, Shorid Samaj o Rashtra, which did not immediately appear in English. And there's an interesting story about that as well, where he talks about health, public health, ideas about the body, productivity, and a kind of colonial capitalist modernity. And then, of course, Gyan Prakash's 1999 book, Another Reason, which takes on history of science and its connections to state building. So these were definitely, when I started studying history of science, in India, history of science was largely a history of institutions and great men. And it continues, unfortunately, to be roughly that. Old scientists or scientists who think they've got everything they had to do with science and now want to do something else, they're the ones who turn up at history of science conferences. They're the ones who usually speak of it. There's a little more interesting stuff happening in sociology now. But historically, the history of science has largely remained that. A few others were beginning to work, like Pratik Chakraborty, for instance, or Poonam Bala, but they did not have any explicit interest in the subaltern, and it remained a fairly nationalist, colonialist story. That what was colonial, what was national, were our institutions being held back by colonial racism, etc. But so my inspiration were actually these books, which usually when you think of history of science as a field, if you think at all about it, these are not things that are part of the canon, but these are part definitely of some kind of subaltern canon. So the point I want to make is that something we often forget is the very significant role the whole Subaltern Studies project has had in constituting a new kind of history of science. That we constantly refer to it as a project that came out of peasant studies, peasant rebellion, popular politics. All of that is true. But it has also played a very, very big role in history of science that is not acknowledged either in the context of subaltern reminiscences, nor in the context of history of science's own telling of its history. So, but these created a different genealogy where questions like the ones I started with, the violence that is being wrought, could be asked. So, next slide, please. But this was not all. There was another very different engagement as well, which emerged slightly later. So Gautam Bhadro, for instance, as we all know, has been incredibly invested in building up a new archives, and a huge component of that new archive were advertisements. And the advertisements, if you go through advertisements, 19th century advertisements, actually, I think medical products are the most advertised things. So if you look at these, are both pictures taken from one of Gautam Da's articles. If you go through the old advertisements that Gautam Da was collecting, I would hazard a guess that about 60 to 70% are medical ads in it. So, so this was not directly coming. It was not in the same. It was not making the same intervention that Dipesh Da's Anushtup essay or Arnold's book or Gyan's book was doing, but it was giving us new resources as well. It was opening up a new archive. On the other hand, David Hardiman, who of course has a long and very different engagement with, particularly in Western India, through his interest in religion, had got interested in healing. And again, there's a problematic division that used to be made then between healing and medicine. Healing was the things that don't work, but people believe somehow, whereas medicine was the thing that did work, apparently. David had got interested in it, and he later wrote Missionaries and Their Medicine, a fantastic work that looks not only at colonial missionary medicine, but also post-colonial Indian convert Christians and how they have created new rituals of healing, new forms of church-based Christian forms of healing. So these were also happening. So there's like, if you think of the whole subaltern collective, there's so much interest in history of medicine and history of science. You could almost call it a school of history of medicine or science, but we never do, which is another surprising thing, that it's almost out in the open and we don't acknowledge that contribution as often, I think. So next slide, please. But I also want to, having said that there's so much of interest in subaltern studies on history of science and medicine, I also want to flag the fact that these interests are not all the same. There are many subaltern studies and different people are coming at it from different sides. So I think the two domains that we've heard a lot about, and I'm sure everybody knows already, the elite and the subaltern, is two interacting but relatively autonomous domains of politics and consciousness. That has had a remarkably enabling effect, despite all its problems, has had a remarkably enabling effect in understanding what is happening to science in society. Because science, what is science has changed a lot from the 18th century to today. It's changed a lot. What it means, its methods, how it's done, who does it, everything has changed. The one thing that has not changed is that it always defines itself against something called non-science. That's usually then also called superstition or religion or other things. So there's a kind of dichotomy that continues to define science. And in understanding that by dichotomy, I think the two domains has been really interesting. And it's kind of equalized the playing field somewhat. And this is most clearly available in Prakash's Another Reason, where he shows that not only the colonialists, but the nationalists were part of that world of science, and they were clearly distinguishing between themselves and those who were not scientific enough. Dipesh Chakraborty's early essay did this very explicitly, but this is why I said there's an interesting story. So David Hardiman and I co-edited a book called Situating Subaltern Therapeutics, which included essays by some of the old subalternists. And I asked Dipesh, your Anushtup essay is not available in English. Can I translate it? And he was like, okay, but I have moved away from that and I don't agree with most of what I said in it. So there's a very interesting, so Doipayan Shen and I translated his essay, which is available here, but Dipeshda insisted on adding a postscript in which he disavows everything that has been said and says, I don't really know why these youngsters still like that, but I think the state is a much more interesting and important thing. Basically, he doesn't want to give up on the state. He wants to embrace the transformative capacity of the state. But that postscript is definitely, even if you don't read the translation, read the postscript. It's an interesting marker of Dipeshda's own thought and how it has changed. So he had the two domain theory, but not later. Arnold clearly had it in Colonizing the Body, though again, not later. Arnold also had brought out the Health and Hegemony. His last chapter in Colonizing the Body is called Health and Hegemony. So again, the Gramscian strand, he was more interested in how does health and medicine and science play a part in creating a hegemony. Gautam Bhadra, as I've said, brought to it new archives. So they're not all contributing the same thing. They're accenting different parts of the corpus that was Ranajit Guha's writings or the larger subaltern writings. And then Hardiman, of course, was interested in subaltern knowledges. So he's also gone on to write about Sai Baba's healing miracles and things like that. So anyway, just wanted to flag that, and then going to what is my last slide. So, yeah. So what does do? So as I said, that I started with this idea of retrospective drawn from Ranajit Guha of like putting things in a new seriality. Can sometimes a new aggregation in a new seriality can reveal something new or a new kind of take on the old material. So I did that with science, hopefully showed you the place of violence in science. Then I did that with the subalternist writings and hopefully showed you that history of science has been a major part of the subaltern project, even though it's not acknowledged. And now finally, so what? All this is great, but so what beyond the hagiography? So I think it is actually given where, and also the enormous influence that science and medicine today have, we no longer, I think, live in a really military industrial complex. We live in a medical industrial complex now. Everything, as we saw that recently with the pandemic, how states as different as China and India have all used the pandemic to ramp up surveillance technologies, policing, draconian measures of population control, all of it. So I think history of science is a field we need to engage with, and we ignore it at our peril. But what can a subaltern history of science do for us? Well, history of science as it exists, as I said, I'm talking of the field in the West. In India, it continues to be great men and great institutions, and how science is such a progressive thing that will lead us from darkness into the light. But in the West, the field has, its beginnings were Eurocentric and Orientalist. In fact, ISIS, which is the main journal of the field, started in 1913 by George Sarton, had amongst its first 3 assistant editors, Prafullo Chandra Rai, who then wrote a number of pieces on ancient Hindu chemistry and stuff in it, which was his pet hobby, of course. So it has very Eurocentric and Orientalist roots. recent attempts have belatedly woken up to the fact that there is a world beyond Europe and the West and tried to embrace the so-called non-Western / global, but it has done so by one of two modalities. One is the non-Western as circulation. So the circulation has become a big thing. Everything circulates as if we live in a like hydraulic system or some drainage or sewerage system where everything just keeps moving. Or the non-Western as decolonial, which I know is Bodhi's favorite topic. So I will leave it to him to say more. But I think both of them, what they do is they produce a victimology that serves Western liberal defenses of big science. These liberal defenses don't want to give up on the hope that science is still this very progressive notion that we need to fight for science. We have marches for science, all of that, and that somehow science is always progressive, irrespective of the fact of how that's playing out here. Like, for instance, here, if you look at most of if you look at the tech institutes and the students and faculty in tech institutes and you see their politics, I think I can just rest my case there. So this whole equation that science and rationality necessarily is progressive and politically progressive is clearly false, but that won't be allowed to stand in the way of Western liberalism's defense of this kind of big, corporatized industrial scale science. And by big science, I mean, this is not your grandfather's science where there was like one J.C. Bose who was toiling away, as Shukarna will tell us, toiling away within his limits to produce something exceptional. These are like big labs with lots of money that mainly want to get patents that have hundreds of people working within them. So this is an industrial scale science that is being defended, which is also very different from the image of the 18th century science that is always invoked. But what can the subaltern histories of science do to this? One is, I think it can emphasize the braiding of violence and persuasion that's constantly there within science. There is no escape from the violence. There is no science that is innocent of that violence. You will need, the vaccine needs to be tested on someone. We all benefit from it, but whose bodies are they being tested on? There will be violence on animals, violence on humans, and those humans will always be marginal groups. Those humans will, and that is how all of science has developed. When anatomy was introduced, we celebrate this still down the road at medical college when it was introduced in the 1830s. Whose bodies were being cut open? No Bhadralok was giving his dead mother or father's body to be cut open. It was the poor whose bodies were being cut open. So that others could. And even now, like if you have friends in the medical colleges, ask them, like when they learn dissection, where do they get the bodies from? Whose body is that? Nowadays, there's a small proportion of people who willingly donate their bodies, but that's still very small to supply the demand of bodies for everybody. So science necessarily is predatory and violent. And there is no escape from that. That does not deny the fact that we benefit from it, but our benefit, somebody else is picking up the check for our benefit. And that we have to recognize. And I think that is what subaltern studies can do. It can. And I kept going back to Ranajit Guha's essay on torture in the Nokshal period, which actually has a lot of science because he gets into the scientific part of Frantz Fanon's writings in that essay. And he constantly says that it's this inextricability, that violence and persuasion are not two separate things. They're part of the same coin. And that is, I think, something if we do write subaltern histories of science, we can bring that back. It will also dispute science's monopoly on ontological description. So the fact that science alone claims that they talk a lot about non-humans, but how do the version of the non-human we get in these new histories of science are all what zoologists tell us or what physicists tell us about matter. There are no ghosts there. There is no gods or spirits that we had met with in the Shautal Hul. So there's that ontological monopoly that has been permitted to science that needs to be, I think, challenged, because that is the first way in which we can also restore some of this, some of the humanity of those on whose bodies we are producing science. And then finally, it does so without, so of course, like I said, that this decolonial is this big framework that I absolutely despise. And so I think it allows us, a subaltern history of science allows us to write about science and its violence and science in the post-colony as a play, without falling into this kind of essentialized identitarian fictions that assume a kind of pre-political solidarity which does not exist, and these kind of decolonial utopias of the non-colonial things that have somehow been stranded on an island that nobody knew of, and now these cosmologies are going to emerge. We can do away with this kind of simple-minded fiction that is being peddled and actually have a politically engaged and nuanced perspective, not only of science, but of our position as humanists who study science. Science has a lot of authority. Everybody wants their children to study the sciences. Those of us who went in, all my uncles thought I didn't get into joint, that's why I went into the humanities, which is probably true. But I think we need to embrace that. We need to embrace that, and we need to push back and say that we can bring something to it, not just play second fiddle to saying how great science is. Because it is great, but it is also, like all greatness, it stands on the shoulders of a lot of skeletons. So I'll rest there. Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Mukherjee for, it was like a masterclass on the effect, on the impact of subaltern studies in studying science, of his history of science. Thank you. We have some time for Q&A, about half an hour, but as the chair, I'll take my privileges and try to bring these two lectures together. When Upal asked me to chair this session, I was a little afraid because I come from political science and I work on institutions in a pretty structuralist, methodologically quite dependent on data and numbers. And so I was like in the middle of two eminent historians who work in the post-colonial tradition. How would I chair or make sense of it? So here are my brief takes on both the lecture, because I think they do come into a very, very productive conversation. I don't know whether both of them sat down together to emphasize their central points or not, but for me, they came together. So Professor Dube, he makes a very, very persuasive argument to consider the affective and the imminent. And he also talks about the tensions within the subaltern studies, within Guha's work. And he asks us not to try to bring them into one cohesive structure together in order to read them. And he then really makes of course, his literary persuasive skills are like, I was sitting there and I was thinking, right, I should now think about affect and emotions in political science. Now this could be an agenda which I completely missed out. But he talks about the individual, the human, the affect and sensations. And when Projit-da is speaking about his presentation, there also we find that we are talking about the individual, the ones who are not recognized, and the importance of the individual body. And both of them, in the end, agree on a certain thing. And I thought that this was very, 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 very important. One was, both of them talked about an agenda of the future. Projit-da was a little dismissive about the decolonial utopia, but millennial vision is something that Professor Dube is still hopeful about. He makes us think about that. Second, both of them question in the tradition of post-colonial subaltern studies is that this championing of reason and the ontological claim that we often make, I often make in terms of numbers, like the numbers are the truth and nothing exists beyond physical verifiable objects. So both of them contest that. And in that sense, I think we have had a very productive session here, and we have 20 minutes for Q&A. So being a generous chair, I am giving the audience the first chance. Otherwise, I get the first chance to ask questions. But I'm sure many of you will have much more probing questions than mine. So, do we have a mic? Can we pass that mic? So what we are going to do is we're going to do 3 rounds of questions, and so to both of them, so 3 rounds of questions. 3.
Anyway, I think I'm audible. I think anyway. Thank you both of you for the very interesting presentations. My question is for Projit. Whatever you discussed today with a lot of emotion there and aggression, which is all good. I mean, it was really nice listening to you. Now, my question specifically is that, all knowledge systems are products of specific time and political regime. So if we are talking about the epistemic violence of science, the regimes earlier, before science, be it philosophy, metaphysics, or religion, were also equally violent. So what exactly is your plea or hope in terms of a episteme which is devoid of violence? A. And B, now when we, it has often struck me that when we are having this discussion, say, or either on subaltern history or on the, the violence of science, we don't have scientific population, quote unquote. I mean, it is the social science cohort bashing the natural science, and usually it is like that in the other side of the camp. So I think without proper intersectional discussions, these questions are like, I had a good day today bashing the science people or the non-science people. So that's all I want to kind of you to comment on.
Could we have the mic here?
Thank you both. Saurabh, of course, I've read Disciplines of Modernity, and I could completely recognize where you're coming from. Just for the audience who might not have read the book yet, I just wanted to say that you did a really wonderful job of bringing this conference together or workshop together by showing us how the presentations that are actually about reminiscences and the presentations which are about the intellectual journey actually are tightly woven together via the question of immanence and embodiment and the affective. And that, so just saying that, thank you for doing that, because it was appearing till now that we have 2 kinds of presentations in this workshop, and you have just brought that together. So thank you very much for that. Projit, fantastic. As always, I enjoyed your clarity and precision of your thoughts. I just wanted to ask you, I may be wrong here, it seems to me that the subaltern legacy to history of science has almost entirely to do with the question of the life sciences and the human body. Can it be, taken over to the other sciences, which are more about matter or particles or, forces, rather than the human body? Because there is still a kind of closeness between the subaltern consciousness and the subaltern body. And connected to that, could we take your argument to the domain of technology, which may not be exactly coincidental to the domain of science? And in my understanding, much of this industrial, and I totally am with you, that this is not the 19th, 18th century science that we are talking about. It is industrial and pharmacratic, really. So in some senses, could it be said that what we know as the modern life science, or let's say the contemporary life sciences, is much more technologized in terms of having become data-driven, various forms of instrument-driven. It's less quote-unquote science, more technology. And in that sense, in continuity with digital technology, let me put it like that. And, you know, is there a total rupture from this subalternist moment to that? Or can we think that together again? So that is what was interesting me.
Hi, thank you both. Very interesting presentations. I have a question for both of you. Or I mean, one question to each of you. Sorry, if I may. For Saurabh's talk, yeah, I just wanted to ask this question. Actually, this is sort of in continuation of your question to me yesterday, but when you brought up the elementary aspects, and you talked about how Ranajit-da talked about the code. Ranajit Guha talked about the code within the linguistic system, and then you kind of moved on to. So I was wondering if you could just clarify in your when you're talking about affect, immanence, embodiment, what were the changes? Maybe in relation to language or in relation to this code you saw in the elementary aspects and in the later works. I mean, did he, you know, were those, I mean, present in elementary aspects, and then did he change his attitude towards, or you know, just the. No, not in the text. When you talked about elementary aspects, and you talked about this, how he talked about this code, right, within the linguistic system, right? So this code within the linguistic system, I mean, this way of talking about language, right? And later on, these ideas that he had, right? I was just wondering whether you could just chart that transformation within your maybe how language relates to some of the themes you were talking about, and in Ranajit Guha's you know, the progress of his works. And then for Projit, it's interesting. I just talked. I was just thinking. I first sort of saw about this science and hegemony and violence in this Ashish Nandi's work early on, right? Where he talks about this idea of non-modernity. I mean, he brings up the modern and non-modern, which I don't think is there in subaltern studies much, right? So where science is like a discourse of modernity in a way, right? And then there are these non-modern practices. So I was just thinking, you know, if you look at some of the, so if science is like a discourse of being modern in a way, yeah, there's violence and there's, you know, a lot of things that these institutions have wrought on people in the name of science. But groups like, say, if you look at Ambedkarite discourse, where it uses science to challenge the you know, Brahminical hegemony, right, in the name of modernity. So science is a discourse. Or even in Adivasi, you know, I'm working on the making of scripts, right? So they justify you know, scripts as a terms of scientific system, right, where it becomes a discourse of modernity in that way. So that because the non-modern is not politically amenable. Science is an entrance into politics through modernity, right? So I'm wondering whether this is the discourse of science in relation to politics. And then there's the institutions, you know, that is basically the violence of the state and of, you know, the state-sponsored scientific projects, which is what science is doing. So I don't know if that's clear, yeah. So, yeah, these are my.
Okay, so, you know, I'm basically saying that, you know, it's a standard academic conceit to consider something as an analytical nightmare and then, you know, say that I don't like it, so it'll go away. You know, that doesn't. It exists in terms of the politics we like. You know, it exists as the terms of critique and affirmation. that, what I don't like is going to go away. The millennial is larger than us. Can we understand it? The millennial and a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of categories and objects and processes, they're larger than us. Can we be a little more modest? Can we, in some senses, recognize that the millennial, like so many other processes and categories, they abide, they have to be endured. They are much larger than us, right? So thank you for making that point. Now about, I think we're sort of, I'm not completely certain about your question, but the structure and sentiment of elementary aspects bear the affective and the aesthetic. They've not been read that way, but they can be read, and they bear certain kinds of value properties, and which is what I refer to as worldly immanence, which make claims upon us. So I remember reading this when was it? It was out 1983, and walking with my friend Midhat. And we were so, it was a straight reading over 3 days. He finished in 2.5, I finished in 3. I'm like intense, 12 hours a day. I still have my copy with these notes. And we were walking back, after dinner in college. And Midhat we were so intent on the conversation that Midhat really nearly got run over by a coming truck, Now, what I'm trying to say is that there are certain forms of persuasion there. There were certain callings, which had come in. And this can, this is not just about something which is incidental. It was actually a moment. It was about the persuasive powers. And it's in this way I approach Ranajit Guha's words. So my thing is not to basically turn everything into attributes of the analytical, of abstraction, right? But see, in some senses, the aesthetics, the immanence, of the effect of analytics themselves. Take.
Okay. Let me see if I can address all the questions. So, Shurita, the first bit is, I would like to say that what I'm talking about is not epistemic violence. It's real violence in the most physical. So I'm not saying epistemic violence is unreal, but it's not as embodied and visceral as this is. Like when somebody is born and raised in captivity with no chance of release because he's an object of science, or that somebody's blood is taken for sure, or a little child in pain is injected with deadly viruses. This is not epistemic violence. This is as violent as you can get. But for some reason, we don't think of it as that kind of violence. And that is what I want to, that's why I think that we need to talk about this more. We don't ask enough questions of science. Science has been black boxed, and it increasingly has so much authority in our worlds, which we all know from our academic worlds, like the resources that science departments have and the resources that humanities and social sciences have. The resource disparity is a marker of the kind of social value that has been attributed to these disciplines. And there's no science studies or science policy, at least in this country, has not developed as a critical field that is able to hold science accountable to some degree. Similarly, talking to scientists, I think it would be great if we could do it, but I don't think that it is essential that somehow we will, because we bring different sets of tools, we should be confident of our tools and our own disciplinary senses of rigor, which we bring to the study of science as a form of social action. But at a larger scale, I think one of my pet peeves that anybody who knows me knows I rant about a lot is I think what is really broken about our educational system is this tracking business, that it's almost from junior school, you're either humanities or commerce or science. This is obnoxious. This is completely counterproductive. It produces bad science, it produces bad humanities. And I think I mean, I taught in the US for 20 years, and I mostly used to teach pre-med students. There were pre-med students who were majoring in French literature before becoming doctors. But we won't have that here because you have to do PCMB and then gazillion tuitions before you get into medical school. So to Prathama's questions about life science and the human body, again, at an obvious level, you're absolutely right. And I think this is because it partly came out of history of medicine. Of the three initial things I showed, Dipesh Das' essay, Arnold's book were all medicine. Gyan moved into something a little different, museum studies mostly in that case. And I think that there's a way in which history of medicine and history of science abroad exists as separate fields. But history of medicine naturally has to encounter the social much more immediately than history of science, whereas science can build these walls where it can claim that the laboratory is cut off from the social around it. And then you have to work a little harder to insert the social into it. So that's been it. But I would also say at the same time that what is life? And whose question is it? Is it just biology's question? So if you look at, for instance, Latour's famous book, The Pasteurization of Science, Louis Pasteur is a chemist, but he's interested in the question of life. Pasteurization is basically because he wants to, as a good Catholic, he wants to figure out whether life can arise from material constituents or is it something that only God can create. That's the basis of it. So chemists are talking about it. In my other work, I've done work with parapsychology in post-colonial India, which is mostly physicists. So there are all kinds of, so what is the life sciences? I think what is life? And I presented a paper at Parthoda's invitation long back at the center where I was talking of Pran Shakti, and we can probably disengage life and Pran, and then we get a larger corpus of things. But at some level, I think you're right that it's mostly been in this thing. But I do think it can be applied elsewhere. As for technology, I again, we can also, historians of technology these days question what is technology. So we can say that even religion is a technology, a book is a technology. Yeah, but I think it also goes back to this tracking thing, the way we have introduced IITs, and now we are once again trying to insert humanities into it for a whole different set of reasons. But originally it was as if engineers don't need any humanistic training or social scientific training. So there's something about our post-colonial genealogy of the technological that is interesting here. To Nishant's question, yeah, absolutely. My first job was as Ashish Nondi's research assistant. So there's definitely an influence there. But in relation to, I would also say that I want to, while the Foucaultian notion of discourse is, of course, not just talk and writing, it is also, it includes praxis. But when we use, these days when we use discourse, we often lose sight of that. And we just think that it's a lot of, like, you know, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of written stuff, people talking. And that's why I avoid the word discourse, because I think it's become overdetermined in some ways. I would like to emphasize the practical, like the lab work, that the fact that this is, you know, when we talk of state-sponsored science, this kind of genetics work that I'm seeing, the history of that, that develops from the late colonial period, it's not just the big science institutes. They're doing it, of course, they're still doing it. But it's also, once you have these university departments, everybody needs to write a thesis, a PhD thesis. You still need to get somebody's blood for that thesis. So there's like, it has created a machine almost in a delusion sense. It has produced a truth machine in many ways that's not necessarily just directly tied to states' narrow interests. Now it's like everybody who's writing a thesis in genetics is doing some of this. Everybody who's writing a thesis in medicine is doing some of this. So much of it is not directly applied in that sense. So I don't know that, I mean, that's a little tangential, but thank you for the question.
So given the constraints of time, we are just doing one more round of questions. So
hello, yeah, better. So great session. I have a question each for Professor Dube and Dr. Mukherjee. For Professor Dube, so very evocative, very thought-provoking, and it has, of course, a lot of resonance with discussions yesterday, many of the papers. So I have since yesterday been haunted by this words are all I am, or words are all I have, or whatever it is. All that I am, all that I am. So even more powerful there. So, and yet we are talking also about the immanent and the affective. I have a simple question. Would you think of language itself as affect, or words? Is yeah. If you would just right, if you would just sort of talk a little more about that, if you want to or respond to it. Uh, and I'm actually also thinking about insurgency as such, in the sense of whether affect is a kind of insurgent rupture on language or vice versa. In one sense, we talk about the affective as supralinguistic, or we talk about affects of language. But when we think about insurgency, it somehow, uh, you know, throws up probably slightly more complex questions about their relation. I just like to hear your thoughts on them. And for Projit-da, very interesting, very, very, again, packed with very intense material as well. So my question is, would you like to think with me about, a certain different notion of disciplinary power when we talk about medical infrastructures? The question that has been coming up in your presentation about why the subaltern is particularly invisible when it comes to the medical discourse. And this particular invisibility, I'm trying to think whether it is to do with a kind of routinization. Be it taking blood samples, or and if we move from the physical body to matter and particles, as Prathamadi was talking about, it becomes even more routinized. And again, I'm again thinking about insurgency here, whether insurgency can even be a conceptually viable category when we think about medical infrastructure at all. So that's the specific question. And just another thought about pain and the individual body in response to Shurita's question, when you talked about the real violence. This is a rather, this is not a very serious question, but it's a thought about whether or not we want to make a distinction between living and dead bodies. When the corpses are being taken out. And of course, then we are talking about the community's claims over the bodies. It doesn't remain individual so much. And in that case, the notion of pain itself shifts in some serious sense.
So my question is actually to Projit sir. Sir, actually, I'm hesitating to ask this question because I'm not really well versed with the history of science. My knowledge is very weak. But my question is, that's actually a two-part question. The first part is this entire fascination about objectivity and facts that science, pertains to. If we closely look to these facts and objectivity, in a very Foucauldian sense, the powered undertones or the power overtones that facts have, in a sense, how do we tackle that in respect to your entire presentation? And the second part actually derives from the first part, is that if by veritably tackling this power undertone or overtone, can this quote unquote Berlin Wall between the social science and the natural science can actually be broken? So this is actually my question. Thank you so much.
My question is not so much as a question as well as an invitation to, this is to Professor Mukherjee. Unfortunately, I entered midway through your talk, so please correct me if this has already been said before. But I couldn't just help ask because this has been such an entertaining Q&A session. So it kept sort of running around in my mind, this particular thought. When you talked about big science, the setting up of big science in India too, was accompanied by a particular struggle between scientific establishments themselves about who got to define science for the nascent Indian state, right? So, for example, Jannabi Phalke tells us about the great struggle between IISc Bangalore, Homi Bhabha and Meghnad Shaha to define who gets to sort of centralize the resources of the government of India in order to spearhead the new nuclear program, right? And in that particular way, the whole thing was taken over by Bhabha, who then went into the Atoms for Peace conference and gave the presidential speech and became the quote-unquote face for the Indian nuclear program. The fallout of which that we are getting to see in Rocket Boys, for example, right? So we are getting to see a whole new sense of narrativization of big science, which sort of does away with this struggle inside, right? So what I wanted to sort of invite you was, if you could say a few things about what you think about the intersections that this particular struggle that we get to hear about might have with how you thought about the intersections between subaltern studies and how we think about science.
As you began with Ranajit Guha's perception of history of science, I was just remembering that the 1982 lectures that he gave in the Calcutta University on subaltern perspective, he often drew parallel evidences from the history of science, just like the Itihash Vidya has collapsed, just like the geocentric universe model. And later on, he focused on the colonial state and modernity. And the historiography that you shown, the most prominent of them being David Arnold, he has also focused on the colonial state and colonized body, public health, modernity, and so on and so on. But when we are reading the history of science in the 19th or 20th century, colonial or post-colonial times, we need to know what happened back then, right? You use vernacular text on Nari Vigyan to understand how pocket watch is being used as a braided science. But the comfort zone of subaltern studies are the 19th and 20th centuries, colonial and post-colonial time. I want to ask you that, is there anything that subaltern studies offers to understand the history of science behind the 19th or perhaps the 18th century? This is my question. What it would say beyond its, maybe if I say the comfort zone.
So just one request. We are running short of time. So if the eminent speakers could be a little brief.
Sure. Okay, I'll try to be super brief. So Shukarna, thank you very much. Routinization, certainly, and I think it is also about temporality. And that those two are linked, of course. The way that certain routines are maintained in a hospital, they're about time and how much time you can actually spend with. If you imagine for medicine, think of the old GP that's now an extinct species, how much time they spent with you and how much time does the modern doctor spend with you while she's looking at the computer screen half the time. So insurgency, whether it's possible or not, interesting question. There is a whole thing about biohacking that people do, particularly those who are trying to transform their own genders. They do a lot of that's, I would call that like insurgent medical knowledge, where they read up on hormones and inject themselves and have support groups that learn to do this outside of the medical apparatus as such. Living and dead body, we'll have to decide when you die, because there might be afterlife. And so this is my interest in parapsychology and Bhutan, of course, other stuff. So the question about objectivity is absolutely, I mean, you're absolutely right. We have to get to the power of it. But I'll also say there's a fantastic book by Peter Gallison and Lorraine Daston on the history of objectivity, which tries to, it's not perfect, but it gives us a way of starting to historicize objectivity itself. What are the practices and techniques of objectivity? And they have changed radically. And of course, we're sitting in the Mohalanobish Auditorium. Statistical objectivity is now often seen as the most objective thing, which is not causal objectivity as it was. And the two culture divide, I would say that this is also a construct. It doesn't actually work. If you see how scientists really work, there is no such clear divide. But it's in the narrativization. And this takes me to the second question of the narrativization of science. Of course, Rocket Boys is happening within a whole privatized media landscape. But the INB Ministry of India for a long time, and even the films division, had done several ones on great scientists. Incidentally, they were all on great scientists, not on like a scientific idea or a process. It was all on an individual. So that, again, like sustains a much older image of science, which is identified with individual brilliant people and does not necessarily talk of the, which for the early post-colonial state might have been a way of not talking about the resource shortcomings that it perceived its own science from suffering. But now it also has another ideological dimension. Finally, the question about what can subaltern studies offer? First of all, thank you for reading my chapter or book. That is great. But the 1982 lecture, I have to go back and read this again. And before 19th century, I will say one thing that we also need to be careful about how far we want to take science, the concept, because the word scientist is only invented in 1835. There is no word called scientist before that, because it does not exist as a socially recognizable occupation. What you have are natural philosophers in Europe. Here we have other things like a Hakim or a Pundit or whatever we call them. And those categories and the kind of knowledge, and one thing I will say in brief is that, see, much of modern science is based on regularities in observing. That is why statistical proof is so reliable, regularities over large scale. Whereas a lot of the pre-modern stuff is often premised on exceptional cases. So people, great kings, assemble the most exceptional objects, and the men of knowledge study that. So that is a qualitatively very different. There is violence definitely there as well. If we want, we can go and look for it. But I think it's I would be hesitant to use the word science. Probably better to use natural philosophy for that period. So I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. So thank you very much, Shukanya. The really critical, crucial, imaginative questions. And correct me, but reduced to their basics, your questions are: is language affect? Not just if language is effective, but is language effect? Is insurgency a rupture with language? Yeah? So, I'd like to actually go back to elementary aspects where insurgency is encoded in and enacted as a linguistic code. And yet, what Ranajit Guha does is to expand the notion of the linguistic and language itself, because these languages of insurgency invoke bodily gestures, bodily movements, the acts of eating, the acts of gestures, right? So what are the terms and figurations of language at work here? And the moment you move to this, when one moves to this, one recognizes that all this is about forms of practice which are profoundly effective. I mean, and you're actually expanding. I mean, I'm reading Ranajit Guha in what are hopefully critically productive ways. So, instead of beginning with that bounded intentional subject, I think we might approach these forms of language as being constituted by embodiment, by sensuous life. I mean, eating is. So, is a profoundly sensual act. It's made up of smell. It is made up of, it's made up of taste, of color, of likes, of dislikes. So that, is to say that language is about effect, but it's also to recognize it is effective, it is about effect, effect is about language, but language understood more widely than just words. And in fact, if Ranajit Guha was nothing but words, that's itself suggesting that we should not privilege words qua words, right? Now, this gets me to the other point: is insurgency a rupture with language? In a sense, I've answered the question. Insurgency is constituted by language, But why did you ask that question? I suspect it's, you know, and this is again a kind of a double-sided reading. I think there is, insurgency is about, it can only be our preoccupation with rupture, which means that the millennial hasn't really gone away, is in some senses about separating difference from discipline. Can we, you know, so insurgency then becomes difference which makes a rupture, which makes an incision and a rupture with discipline. But insurgency creates its forms not only of difference, but of disciplines, which mutually beget each other. And all this is not sort of, you know, gobbledygook. In some senses, it's about, my entire point has been not just to play with words, not just looking at the world in terms of epistemologies and arguments and so on. It's about, can we actually, speaking of smell and taste, and they abound, right? They abound. So can we actually face up to the mix-ups and murk of social worlds, you know? So when I was speaking about analytical nightmares, I was really speaking about the fact that, you know, must we intellectualize and see everything in terms of these forms of epistemology? Or can we actually abide? Can we actually endure these smells, the colors, you know, which make claims upon us, which, you know, which drive us? So, you know, and can we do this in a way? Can we actually fold these into our analyses? And it's, you know, this is where I go back to you know, linking it back with the discussion yesterday about historical fact, what is history, historical discipline, you know, and how do we deal with it? You know, Gadamer's point about the, you know, our experience of the past, which we already have, as exceeding the documentations of documentary historiography and explanatory anthropology, for instance. You know, there's a significance. When do you understand the significance of time, of age? I think a baby does it, of gender. A baby does it when it is held, when she's held in the mother's arms. The mother's arms, you know, are about a certain form of security. The grandmother holds her in a different way. You learn a sense of age. Now, these are, you know, the father, the distant father, the proximate father holds it in a particular way. The understandings of, you know, of intimacy, but also of age. The intimacy of the large and the small precede those documentations of, you know, of formal historiography, which you would encounter through the nightmare of streams, which you talked about, right? So, you know, there's something which is very palpable here. And it's actually, I'm not putting it, I don't have the clarity of Projit, but, you know, what I'm trying to get at is that there's something very proximate about it, and it abounds. We have to, you know, if we only care to bring it into the ways in which we understand words and approach and live them.
Thank you. What a wonderful session. And I would thank Professor Dube and Professor Mukherjee. And I would borrow from the parting comments of Professor Dube that other than words, we also have to affect, and we also have to sense and smell. And so we would, after this session, we are breaking for lunch, and we are going to, and immanent and affective lunch, but we are going to reconvene at 1:45 a little bit, but I would urge everyone to stick to the time, because as you can understand, we are just running behind the time a little bit. We have wonderful panels post lunch. And to finish up this wonderful session, I want to thank Professor Dube, Professor Mukherjee for their excellent presentations. And also to the audience to the audience because we had a fascinating Q&A session. And thank you, everyone. And we'll see you on the other side of lunch. Thank you.